Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and I'm excited to be with you today to talk about the last of the SASs issued in a suite by the AICPA. Today we're going to talk about proposed SAS, the auditor's responsibility for other information included in an annual report. Now this will update extant AUC section 720, which is currently called Other Information in Documents Contained in Audited Financial Statements. As you can tell by the change in title, we're moving away from a generic focus and we're tightening up the focus of the SAS to focus on annual reports. And so the new title really talks about some of the changes here. This is to help clarify when this SAS and this AUC section is going to be relevant. So a little bit of background here. This is part of the convergence with the ISAs, and so the ISAs have already updated in this section. However, we wanted to ensure that we were still tailoring to a U.S. environment, and so there were some changes to terminology and definitions to reflect the U.S. environment. So let's talk about some of the key changes here. And as I said earlier when we were talking about the title of the SAS, it is really related to the scope. So it's focused in on documents containing audited financial statements, but specifically annual reports. And I'm going to define shortly what is an annual report. It does say also something that would be similar to an annual report because we also have to worry about things like a CAFR for a government or a not-for-profit entity. Now, it applies even if a item isn't called an annual report, but it meets the definition. And it also does not apply when something is called an annual report, but it does not meet the definition. Now, certain things are definitely not in scope. Anything that's RSI, that's covered by AUC section 730, and anything covered under the SI, which would be AUC section 725. So we're really looking at this information. Now, as a reminder, our opinion is not going to cover the other information, right? So we're not going to be writing an opinion on it, and we're not trying to obtain evidence necessarily on this other information. We're actually trying to clarify what the auditor's responsibilities are related to this information. So as I said, they have defined what is an annual report, and that definition is very important. So I apologize, but I am going to have to read it to you. So it says a document or combination of documents prepared typically on an annual basis by management or those charged with governance in accordance with law, regulation, or custom, the purpose of which is to provide owners or similar stakeholders with information on the entity's operations and the entity's financial results and financial position as set out in the financial statements. So as you can see here, we're trying to provide information about both the operations as well as the financial statements, typically going to owners, but it could be other stakeholders, for example, for a not-for-profit entity or for a governmental entity. It goes on to say that an annual report contains, accompanies, or incorporates by reference the financial statements and the auditor's report. Right? So in order for this to be an annual report, it has to have the financial statements in there. So other information that does not include the financial statements isn't relevant here. So even if you call something an annual report, but it doesn't have the financial statements and the auditor's report, it's not subject to this SAS. It goes on to say it and usually includes information about the entity's developments, its future outlook, and risks and uncertainties, a statement by the entity's governing body, and reports covering governance matters. So there's a lot of different things that could be in here, but we have to, again, have those financial statements and the auditor's report. It does go to explain here that annual report includes annual reports of government, sometimes referred to as a CAFR, and organizations for charitable or philanthropic purposes that are available to the public. So really trying to define what is the scope of this as by defining the annual report. Remember, the title changed. So what are some of the things that we have to consider here? Well, it requires the auditor to determine through discussion with management, and here's the key, and obtain management's written acknowledgement regarding which document or documents make up the annual report. It can be more than one, and the entity's planned manner and timing of the issue. So the goal here is to clean up any confusion between the auditor and management over one, what is going to be defined as the annual report, and two, what the auditor's responsibilities are. And so management is going to have to write down and assert what are their annual reports. That could be done either in an engagement letter, a rep letter, or even an amendment to an engagement letter. But this is just going to clarify what constitutes the annual report, and therefore we'll be able to talk about what procedures would have to be applied. So what is the auditor's objective? Well, first off, they have to read the report, right? So whatever the annual report is, they have to read the other information. And then they have to do three things. First, consider whether there's an immaterial inconsistency between the other information and the financial statements. So based on our knowledge of the financial statements and reading the other information, did we notice anything? Now, there's a couple of things here. We're going to have an expanded responsibility here. We have to compare selected but not all amounts. So because we're not giving an opinion on this information, we're not really subjecting it to audit procedures, we just have to look at selected information, obviously the more material items, and ensure that it's not in conflict with the financial statements. However, it goes on past the financial statements to look at consider whether there is a material inconsistency between the other information and the auditor's knowledge obtained in the audit. Remember, in AUC 315, we understand the entity and its environment. So we are trying to get information about things that are changing, things that they're doing regarding their product line. Are there any new products? Are there any new locations? And so from that information that you gathered as part of your understanding the entity, your knowledge is pretty vast about what's going on besides just the financial statements. And so your objective here is to say, okay, well, is the other information misleading, or is there a material inconsistency with what you know about the entity? And then obviously respond appropriately when the auditor identifies that such material inconsistencies either appear to exist or when they become aware that other information appears to be materially misstated. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in a minute. But this is obviously expanding the role of the auditor related to this other information. So what does misleading mean? It says a misstatement of the other information exists when the other information is incorrect or incorrectly stated, so it's factually wrong, or here's the new words, otherwise misleading. So it includes omitting or obscuring information for a proper understanding of a matter disclosed in the other information. So currently, AUC 720 does not require the auditor to consider whether the information omits or obscures information. And so that's newly required in this SAS. And as we go through it, the reason why they feel like you can undermine information by having information that's either irrelevant or obscuring the true understanding of this information. And so the proposed SAS is there to try to incorporate all of those. So it's broader than what currently is in there today, which is the terms inconsistency and misstatement of fact. So that's what we talk about today. The proposed SAS broadens that to include any kind of omissions, but also obscurities or providing information that's either unnecessary or inconsistent. And now it does say that the auditor is not responsible for searching for omitted information or the completeness of the other information, but obviously based on what we know. Now there is a reporting aspect to it. If you have at the date of the auditor's report received some or all of the other information, so you've obtained something, or you maybe you've obtained all of the other information, you've actually received the annual report, then you have a section of the report in the auditor's report called other information. So if you remember in some of the earlier blogs when we showed some examples of audit opinions, I said we're going to get to this. Well, this is what we're talking about. So obviously here we're trying to explain a little bit more about what we did with this other information. Today, the current AUC 720 does not require the auditor to make any reference to other information. You can, but you're not required to. Now going forward, we're obviously going to be required to if we've received any of it as of the date. So as you can see here, there's the other information paragraph, and it says management is responsible for the other information it comprises, and you would describe it, but does not include the financial statements and our auditor's report thereon. So obviously we've provided an opinion on that. Our opinion on the financial statements does not cover the other information, and we do not express an opinion or any form of assurance on it. And then it goes and says, what did we do with it? In connection with our audit, our responsibility is to read the other information, and in doing so, consider whether the other information is materially inconsistent with the financial statement or our knowledge obtained in the audit, or otherwise appears to be materially misstated. If based on the work we performed, we conclude there is material misstatement of this other information, we are required to report that fact. We have nothing to report in this regard. So in this example, obviously, we're not providing any information. Now, you would not provide this paragraph if you were giving a disclaimer or opinion. So if you remember back to the blog that we did regarding the types of opinions out there, you could provide it for qualified or adverse, depending on where the impact is on the qualified or adverse opinion. So why were you giving it? If it was a scope limitation specifically related to this, that would be different than, for example, if it was a topic that's totally unrelated to this other information. Now, I did want to point out that AICPA is great in that they have very specific comments that they request. You can give comments on anything you want, but certainly they have certain things they want to hear of. And so one of the things they want to know is, does that paragraph inappropriately imply that the auditor has obtained assurance or has expressed an opinion on the conclusion on the other information? So clearly we say we don't, but they want to get our opinion on whether we agree with that. In terms of scope, it applies regardless of whether you obtain it before or after the auditor's report. So if the annual report isn't ready at the report date, you can still issue, but you still have additional work that's going to need to be done after you issue your report. If that's the case at the audit report date, you would get a rep in your rep letter that indicates that it will be provided to us when it's ready, as soon as possible. You can issue the report. However, no update procedures would be required when you do the additional work related to the other information, besides doing what this SAS requires regarding reading it and verifying that the information isn't inconsistent. So not a lot of additional work, but there is a requirement. Even if you don't have it at the report date, you still have some work to do. In terms of documentation, you would have to document the procedures that you performed, and then also include the final version of whatever the other information is into your work papers. In terms of our key dates, comments are due by May 15, 2018, consistent with the other two proposed SASs. And the proposed effective date for this proposed SAS is for audits of financial statements for periods beginning on or after June 15 of 19, early implementation not being permitted. So that wraps up the big section here. We've gone through a lot of different blogs talking about the 3 proposed SASs. We had 1 on the omnibus. We had 4 on the changes to the auditor's report, and this one will wrap up with the annual report, other information. So excited to finally wrap this up. So I encourage you, there are 3 proposed SASs. Again, I encourage you to respond if you have any thoughts regarding them. That's part of our whole concept of due process. So with that, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you on a future webinar where we'll move on to some of the other exposure drafts that are out there that we can talk about now. So thank you, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.